City Matters.
Welcome back here to the Fog of War and Humanity on hmTv. We have a very special author with us today. Her book, Bridge from Saigon. Mai, we spoke about your earliest moments. We touched upon a lot within our first episode today, which has been just truly amazing. Now you're a young girl. You're in Philadelphia. You saw the very end of the Vietnam War between America's involvement and then the communist takeover of Vietnam, where they're going to unify it under communism itself. Did you have family members that got left behind in South Vietnam?
I had a lot of relatives left on both sides of the war, actually. So my mother's family, by which I mean like her uncle, was actually quite high in the Communist Party. He was Minister for Science, Technology, and the Environment, which I didn't know until I was an adult and went back to Vietnam. But her father, my maternal grandfather, had also been a party member, and he was close friends with Trần Huy Liu, who was the party's main propaganda minister. And so, he had spent time being a revolutionary with Vo Nguyen Giáp and other military luminaries that.
Now, were they lived up north? Were they up?
Both my parents were born and raised in the north. My father's side of the family was the opposite. So my paternal grandfather was a landed mandarin. He was a village chief. He wasn't anti-communist, but in those days in the north, unless you were in the party, they considered you the enemy.
Sure.
And both my grandparents were killed by the communists under very different circumstances. So my communist grandfather was killed in a party purge in 1948, 49. And
so that's shortly after end of World War II. The North, right, they're trying to solidify their power, right?
Exactly. There was a lot of infighting. There was also a lot of mutual suspicion all throughout the party because nobody knew, which factions you were with, whether you were collaborating with the French or not. So he was killed in a party purge. My other grandfather didn't die until after 1954. What had happened was that the communists started persecuting people, that they thought were not revolutionary. So they would start confiscating your land or your, what you produced on your farms, your property. And that was what gradually happened to him. He was also a teacher, but he couldn't teach when, the world was so chaotic. Like you couldn't set up a schoolroom. So his fortune was kind of dwindling. My father decided at age 17 that he didn't want to grow up this way, and he left actually on an American aircraft carrier down to Saigon. And after he left, the communists rounded up several family members, including one of my father's uncles, and killed them, stoned them to death. My grandfather, though, they refused to kill outright because he had been a teacher and he had actually taught a lot of the men in the local Communist Party leadership. And, last episode, we talked about how teachers are sacred in Vietnam. It's really true. It's like they're like cows in India. You just don't touch them. In fact, every year, Vietnam has a Teacher's Day, which is kind of like if you pulled together Veterans Day and Thanksgiving and Mother's Day all in one. The whole world stops, right? Businesses close and everyone travels to go visit their favorite teacher. And I mean everyone. I mean like 50-year-olds and 10-year-olds. That's what a teacher means. And so they just could not bring themselves to kill him. Like they thought that would be public sacrilege. So instead, what they did was they put him in jail, and he became ill and died in jail.
Let me ask you, it sounded like he had a little bit of a target on him, right? That they didn't think that he wasn't radical enough or communist enough or too far to the left. Him being a teacher, were they a little concerned about what he might have said, because they almost doubted his communist loyalty, if that makes sense, right?
Well, they actively spied on him, so he never said anything
Yeah.
wrong. It wasn't that, it was just that, part of the revolution was taking land from people who had it
Sure.
and kind of
Making it centralized, right?
yeah, destroying the bureaucratic structure that had been there before. So he was never going to survive. It was just a matter of like how they would have him die. So when we went back in the late 90s, I felt like I was related to half the country. I still had relatives in the North who were both in the party, and relatives who were on my father's side who were really suffering because they were on the wrong side of the war. And in the South, I had lots of relatives too.
When you say wrong side of the war, Vietnam falls, North Vietnamese tanks go in, they actually drive in with their lights on because they know everything is collapsed, right? Did you have family members that were sent to like re-education camps or anything along those lines?
Yeah, we did. I had one uncle in the South who was in the military and got sent to a re-education camp for 10 years.
Wow.
And when he got out, we actually sponsored him and his family to Philadelphia. So he had like 7 kids, and they were a bit older than me, and they all came over. And you could tell that he had been broken.
How were they able to get out? That must have been, if he's there 10 years, probably about 85, 86, right? How were they able to do that? That's just pretty amazing. Obviously they had to have the paperwork and the sponsorship, right? And a means of getting out of the country.
Yeah, so we paid for them to come out, and it wasn't it was much more orderly and safe because the US had an actual program for family reunification. So that's how my dad managed to get them out. And I think there was actually a priority for people who had been in re-education camps.
What was the communist view of letting your family members go? Was it one less mouth to feed? Was it that, I'm not sure, if they really cared that much about the family ties? I don't know. What was their view from that end of that program there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm just kind of guessing here, but my guess is that even though it was still illegal to leave the country without permission, like if you were caught on a boat, right, you'd be arrested. But I do think they were trying to normalize relations with the US. And this was a priority for the US diplomatically.
Which is interesting, right? Because we pull out of there in 73. We completely pull out in 75 in terms of embassy and any type of relations. That's not too long after. And the Vietnamese realize that even though they're communists, they want their economy to be strong. They have a large population. They're trying to modernize more and manufacture more and everything else. And that's the thing that a lot of countries around the world, people don't always understand here, is how strong this country and how other countries want to be tied to us. They might not always agree with everything that we say and do, but, and you see that with the Vietnamese, right? You see that with a Vietnamese communist government. It's the first war we ever lose. And, the feelings weren't great there for a long time. And those winds of change have really done exactly that. Like, look what you say. You go back in 98, right? Then you go back 2016, and you just see those changes. And let's say you go back in the next couple of years, you'll probably see that progression. I would say again, right?
Yeah. I think one thing you can say about the Vietnamese is they adapt really quickly. Um, you know, that was how Ho Chi Minh one made the kind of gains that he did, right? He adapted to um, what was happening during World War II. He played the Allies off one another. He did his best to get support from the US. When that didn't work, he turned to the Chinese and then the Russians. I mean, he just kept adapting.
He was a waiter, right, in the United States, Ho Chi Minh, for a little bit. It was something crazy like that. Like Fidel Castro loved baseball, and he actually came here and tried out for a baseball team. But I think Ho Chi Minh, you talk about these dominant communists. I think I could be wrong, but I think he did spend a little time either here or in England, and he might have been a waiter.
I do know that he did spend time in the West. But then, the war, the American war ends, and it doesn't take that long under their relationship with Russia and China to realize, first of all, there was a war with China, so no trust there. And the USSR was not doing great, right? By the late 80s, that was starting to fall apart, and they could see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, no country who couldn't feed their people was ever going to compete with the technology of the United States. And at that time, mid to late 1980s, the Soviets had food shortages, lack of technology. I mean, where you and I would go to the store and look at 10 different types of chocolate chip cookies or bread or milk, right? It was nothing there. People had to get vouchers.
I remember on our first scouting trip back to Vietnam, it would have been 1997, when we landed in Saigon. I called it Saigon at the time, and we tried to pay at the hotel. We gave them our credit card, and the sign said they accepted credit cards, but the woman at the desk wasn't sure what to do with it. She'd like feel the edges of it. She ran her finger over the numbers. She finally ended up calling the phone number to figure out what to do with it. But it's like, everything was new to them.
And they probably still liked American cash over there too, I would imagine also. Now, when you go over there, whether it's a couple years back when you went and then a ways back, if you say Saigon over there, do they look at you differently? Do they realize that you're a little bit of an outsider? Or
To say Saigon to people I don't know when I'm there. But yeah, they would look at you funny. Also, you have to remember, Vietnam is a very young country. More than half of Vietnamese are under the age of 35, right? Which means they don't remember the war.
There's no knowledge of that.
Yeah, they don't remember a Saigon.
So now you speak perfect English, right? And that's something that's drilled into you in your earliest days in Philadelphia, right? Your father sees the advantage, like it's a necessity. When you go to Vietnam and you speak Vietnamese, do they pick up on it that you're from outside the country?
Yes. So when I first went back to Vietnam, I would say I had like fourth grade level Vietnamese. And then when we actually lived there, I took Vietnamese language lessons and I got much better. But it was kind of a skewed way to learn the language because I had to learn enough Vietnamese to do health policy work and medical research, but then like regular speaking Vietnamese too. And I did okay, but if someone just meets me in a store, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. It's if you got me into a long conversation. I think you could tell. One, because of my accent. It's not that I sound American when I speak, but I don't sound either North or South. My dad's like, your accent is very muddy. You could be anywhere in the country. The other thing was it took me a little while to learn that some of the vocabulary words I was using that I had learned from my parents no longer meant the things that they used to mean, right? So the phrase "nhà thương," I grew up learning that it meant hospital. But by the late 1990s, it meant mental institution. So
Wow.
my college was like, yeah, stop saying that. Makes you sound weird.
Now, did you guys become citizens? Did it take you a while to become citizens? Are you citizens of the United States?
We're naturalized. It didn't take as long as you would think. I think it wasn't more than 5 years before we were naturalized.
Later on, right? So you probably become a citizen by the time you're 12, 13 years old, right? Later on when you travel, did they give you any grief because they know you're Vietnamese, right? They look at your name, they look at you, right? You speak the language. Did you ever get any grief or anything like that?
First of all, they is not one they, right? They're
Yeah.
Vietnamese, different Vietnamese have very different opinions about overseas Vietnamese. They call us Viet Q. Um, if you're in the North and you're trying to get through customs, they will look at you suspiciously. But if you're just talking to regular people on the street, um, they really gravitate toward you. They want to meet you.
They kind of want to learn from you, right?
They want to learn from you. It's kind of like touching gold. I think it's less like that now because the country's doing so much better economically, and people are now used to foreigners. But in the late 90s,
The dominance of the Communist Party is still firmly in the North, right? Is that still?
it's pretty firm everywhere. I would say you get the same like very polite suspicion if you're talking to party officials, right? But regular people, not so much.
So that people are, would you say, more curious about you than suspicious or?
Yeah, certainly in the late 90s. I think
Yeah.
now foreigners are like no big deal. They're not so
Yeah.
exotic anymore. But at the time, my husband is white and American, and that made them very, very curious about us. And then I got pregnant, and that made them even more curious about us.
Where's your husband from?
He's from upstate New York.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when I said upstate before, you knew exactly what I meant, right?
I know, yeah, my brother lives
Yeah.
in Collegeville. I, did medical training in part of
Wow.
upstate. So
All right. So let's go back to you're younger, right? What were some of the biggest challenges that you're a young girl, you're here in the country, you're going to school. What were some of the biggest challenges that you had, as you were starting to, live in this country and get your education and kind of find your way a little bit?
I think in all the ways that adults tried to help me, like with education or, getting from here to there, all those things worked perfectly fine. I managed perfectly fine. I think the hardest thing for me was being lonely because you have to remember when I was in Vietnam, I had my brothers around me all the time. And I felt safe going up and down our neighborhood streets. I knew people. I had community. In Philadelphia, I did have community, but it was so much bigger, right? And you're 7, and it's a really big world when you're just 7. And my brothers went to a different school. They were in a private school because they got scholarships there. And so I didn't see them after school. And I walked myself to school. I walked myself home. I'd have all these hours before my parents got home from work. And it was just a very lonely way to grow up. Especially when, as a stranger, you're kind of afraid of reaching out to other people. Like if I had been an American kid who just moved to a new city, I'd be confident. I'd go out and knock on people's doors and things. But that wasn't the situation. The people in the neighborhood itself were really friendly, but I didn't know how to access that. So that was hard. And I think the other thing was, I started to explain before, since I didn't have any accent and I seemed pretty competent, I was a pretty good student and I did everything I was supposed to. The adults around me just assumed I didn't need help. And so I think that none of the grown-ups in my world had any sense of like the psychological strain that I was under. Um, and so I had to figure that out by myself too.
Was there ever any times you kind of said, listen, I know I'm doing well over here and I'm picking up on things, but I still need a hand. I still don't understand this, or I'm not quite sure, or were they just so busy because they're trying to get established in this country, and they're trying to make their foundations here for you guys, right?
For sure they were stressed. And I want to emphasize too, like how what an amazing job they did. I mean, they kept us fed and housed and safe and got us educated. All their kids went to Ivy League schools for college, but um, but it would never have occurred to me, Rich, to ask for help because that's not what Vietnamese do.
Yeah.
I grew up watching my parents be so stoic and just doing what needed to be done. It would never have occurred to me.
A lot of immigrants, the same, right? That, you know, a lot of times when the parents, the life isn't really easy on them. It's usually for the younger children, the next generation, right? They're trying to build that foundation to get ahead, and they sacrifice greatly. And you said, "Oh my, I go to Ivy League. My brothers go to Ivy League." They really, they really kind of set the path for you guys, but it wasn't easy. There's no playbook for any of this stuff, right? I mean, right? I mean, there's things that I'm sure they have had to deal with that, your parents are very sharp people, but they're in a new culture, a new way of looking at things, and they're relatively new in the country, and they do an unbelievable, they really do like a phenomenal job. It's amazing. And like I said in the earlier podcast, these are things that people are going to take, that they're going to find things that are familiar with you, that are similar, or they're going to say, wow, this is an unbelievable story, and it is. It's truly amazing. Your brothers, what were certain things that they enjoyed about being in this country? Did they play sports? Did they work? Did they excel at any one thing education-wise?
They were both, I think they graduated number one and number two in their classes. So they did very well, like at school. They were definitely jocks. Um, they both ran cross country and they also both wrestled.
Okay.
And we
I coach both those sports.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, scrawny little Vietnamese guys wrestling. That's
Tough and disciplined,
We had this weightlifting set and bench down in the basement, and they'd like compete with each other and stuff. Um, I think that my oldest brother was he's like your very typical firstborn, do what you need to do, take care of everybody, everything. I think my second brother had a harder time. Uh, I think he's very he's very aware, you know, and I think he was more sensitive to um, just the cultural shock and things. He's done very well for himself now. He's like a super happy guy nearing retirement. He's a lawyer and an engineer, and he does beautiful art. He's like got a great family, but the growing up part was really hard.
Do you mention any of that in your book in terms of your own family, your siblings?
Yeah, I didn't talk a lot about my brother's experience. I talked about my experience of my brothers and our relationship, but I didn't talk about their experience growing up, in part because I feel like that's their story.
Sure.
Um, and and because there was like enough in the book already. Um, uh, and at the time, honestly, I didn't I didn't feel confident enough to ask them. what their experience was like.
Is that something that's just very personal? You know, it's a tough situation for you and your family, you know, and it's got to be a personal thing, I would imagine, right?
I mean, Rich, it took me years to figure out how to talk to my parents about it, right? Like that was why that going back to Vietnam was so important, and convincing them to come back to Vietnam while we were there.
Was that some closure for you?
It was definitely the start of closure, because when they did come, it was clear that I was triggering PTSD for my father over and over and over again during that trip. But it kind of gave him practice.
How old was your dad when he went back? How old was he?
Let's see. I was 28. No, I would have been almost 30. So he would have been in his 60s.
So he's an older man at that point, to a degree, right?
Yeah. And it was things like going back to visit his father's grave, whom he felt he had abandoned when my dad left the North.
He's got a pretty tragic background where he was carrying around a lot with them. And then he comes to this country and he's got to stay busy because, that's the only way to survive, right? In terms of...
You know what? His burden wasn't just surviving the things that he did. It was also that he had to still take care of relatives back in Vietnam, because my dad was the only son of the first wife of the village chief.
Wow.
Which means when my grandfather died, my father became the village chief. And so he was constantly sending money and medications and bribes back to family in Vietnam. It was a huge burden. And I could feel that when I got them to come back to Vietnam, because all these relatives would stream in to meet them, and there was all this social pressure. It was a lot on him. Yeah.
And you know what? At the end of the day, great kids, American dream, lived in freedom, right? But in the back of his mind, he knew both the good and the bad side of leaving. Like the communists taking over, but his family being there, and the responsibilities on both sides of the world, right? In terms of overseas and then here. All right, so we're going to come back for a third episode here on the Fog of War and Humanity on hmTV. Mai, thank you very much. This has been great. I look forward to get into your college experiences and some of your training and education, and and how you've still managed ways to cope with your own things that you've dealt with over the years that are pretty serious, and I think this would be very helpful to a lot of people. So we're going to come back for a third episode. Please rejoin us for this very, very interesting look at a bridge from Saigon.